Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers. Michael Kilpatrick here with yet another episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. Today, my guest is Josh Galt, a global nomad turned regenerative agriculture innovator. Now based in Mexico, Josh is pioneering the use of black soldier fly larvae for waste management, animal feed, and organic fertilizer, while collaborating with smallholder farms to develop consumer products like coffee, chocolate, and tropical fruits. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So give us a little bit of an overview. Where in Mexico are you based right now?
I'm in Veracruz, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, about 4.5, 5 hours from Mexico City. So kind of halfway down on the Gulf on the east side, not out on the tourist side like the Tulum, Riviera Maya area. It's more industrial, more agricultural, but it's a beautiful area that's everything grows. So it's a really interesting sort of the tallest volcano in Mexico is sort of sets the barrier. It was the route that Cortez took when he landed in Veracruz and then he went into Mexico City. He sort of went up and over the mountain range. So you have at the beach or at the lower levels, you have a lot of agriculture because it's much warmer. And then only an hour away, you sort of go up into the mountains and they get snow on the peaks and it's really good coffee country. So it's sort of the birthplace of Mexican coffee as well. So it's sort of a real cool mix of mountains and beach and agriculture and industrial port, etc.
Is it relatively safe?
It is, yeah. I've been visiting here for around the last 7 or 8 years. I've lived mostly between Latin America and Southeast Asia for the last 18 years. But Mexico, kind of the last decade. And it's been one of the safest states overall in Mexico. So not quite as much as say Campeche, which is a incredibly safe state where there's a lot of, it's basically just agriculture, but it is fairly safe. Obviously you want to, pay attention when you're out at night in the city or something. Don't be dumb. Yeah.
Yes.
Driving is a whole different issue, but in terms of just living and working and dealing with normal life, it's quite safe. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so talk to us a little bit about kind of like the different projects you've been associated with, because you've done a lot. And then I think after you kind of do that overview, we'll kind of dive into each one specifically.
Sure, yeah. So I'm currently in this insect agriculture world, which I got into about 8-9 years ago in Southeast Asia. I had previously been an extreme athlete traveling the world, running rivers, exploring nature. And so I've always had a deep connection with nature and with sustainability, just from a perspective of I love the planet, I love nature. And so, you have that ethos of pack it in, pack it out. You don't litter, you take care of nature, et cetera. So my interest in sustainability was always from that perspective of being a good steward of the land. I grew up on farms in Canada, being self-sufficient. We didn't have electricity or running water where we lived for first 8 years of my life. And then when we moved back to the US, we lived in Oregon on a farm. And it's one of those things where it's a lesson that hopefully I can learn. And, each generation we want to respect our ancestors, but be better than them, right? So we lived on this incredible farm and we did not take advantage of it. So I grew up seeing farm work and that kind of stuff is like a chore and something I didn't want to do. I was playing sports, it's like, gonna go be a pro football player or whatever. And so my brother and I really didn't appreciate what we had. And now, coming full circle, we've gone back much more to, okay, how can we, get more involved in regenerative agriculture? So about a decade ago, I was in Southeast Asia and I was looking for different innovative agricultural ideas, whether it was vertical farming or things that you could do in the cities. Working with a group of friends and people that I know that are investors, and they were looking for opportunities in the frontier. It's kind of been my life has been travel, mostly in emerging markets and in frontier countries. And so I started looking for different things, and I came across an article that talked about insects as a superfood. And I've always been an early adopter for myself. As an athlete, like I always tested on what can give me that little bit of edge to be healthier, to be faster, stronger, whatever. And so reading that insects were a superfood really changed my perspective, because I very much had the Western mindset of these bugs are gross. My girlfriend at the time would always be buying fried insects on the street. In Cambodia and Thailand, it's a snack, and they think it's delicious. And I thought it was disgusting until I found this Google sort of rabbit hole, and I went down it for half a day, and I was like, okay, let's go buy some insects. I got to try this out because it's supposedly a superfood.
Okay, all right. So then what kind of insects are they eating on the streets?
So it's mostly crickets, grasshoppers, silkworm pupae, bamboo worms. It depends too. Like they will eat things like fried spiders in some areas of Cambodia, scorpions in Thailand. There's a lot of variation in Mexico.
Okay.
You have chapulines, which is a type of grasshopper, but a smaller grasshopper. Gusano de maguey, which was made famous from mezcal, but actually it tastes really, really good. It's a little worm that turns into a moth, but it's a worm that lives in the maguey. So there's a large variety of insects in South Africa. You have the mopani worm, which is sort of a caterpillar that eats these leaves that nothing else really eats, and so people will harvest those and eat them. So I got into the insect agriculture on the food side. I thought, well, this is really cool, and then I found that it's sort of a trending thing, like a superfood. It actually tastes good if it's prepared properly, and it can be very sustainable to farm. So, okay, maybe this has some opportunity. Yeah. But very quickly, I realized that it's going to be a very long path to get people to eat bugs, especially in the West. And the animal feed and fertilizer side is 100 times bigger, and you can make much more of an impact. And as far as a business, it has a lot more upside. So I spent about 3.5 years. I started something called Ento-Vegan, which is essentially plants plus insects. So at the time during all of that process, there's no way to confirm it, but I'm pretty sure I was eating more insect protein than anybody on the planet during that time.
Okay.
Just to test the efficacy on my own body.
Yeah, and you're not dead yet.
Exactly. Well, I did learn a lot of things through that process about how vegetarian, and I don't want to make anybody mad on your listeners, but being a vegetarian is actually much healthier than being vegan. If you want to just compare those two things, forget about carnivore and just a normal diet. But because you have eggs and you can have dairy and you can have bee products, honey, etc. Whereas vegans, it's much more extreme, and so you begin to lose access to the nutrients. And the biggest problem that I encountered was, even though cricket protein, for example, is very nutritious and healthy, and it has minerals, calcium, zinc, etc., I was having teeth problems.
Interesting.
And what I learned through the process is that if you eat too much in the way of leafy greens or broccoli, and it's not steamed at least, they have these phytonutrients that basically block the absorption of minerals. I didn't know that. And so
I didn't know it either. And it's one of those things that kale's good for you. Oh yeah, eat kale. You got to cook it.
Exactly. And quinoa as well. And I was a big quinoa fan, but just realizing you have to sprout it, or you have to soak it for 12 hours overnight or whatever in order to open that up, so you're not basically blocking your nutrient absorption. So even if I could have gotten enough calcium to prevent any teeth issues from the insect protein, I wasn't getting it because I was eating too much in the way of raw vegetables. So that was just a fascinating thing to learn and share that journey with people. And of course, I was not very popular with the vegans, but it brought up lots of philosophical questions of, okay, is being vegan actually better for the environment than, say, farming these insects, which are sort of like intelligent little robots? Yeah. That, there's studies that show that they don't feel pain, et cetera, and they're harvested in a very, they're farmed in a very animal-friendly environment. Yeah. And so you compare that to a huge monocrop field of soy, where you're tilling that up, or you're harvesting and you're killing all of the insects and the wildlife and the baby birds and the rodents and all of those things. I mean, farming insects in a place where you're cleaning up waste, which would otherwise be giving off greenhouse gases, et cetera, and you're transforming that into natural sustainable animal feed, which can replace fish meal and soy and organic fertilizer. It's like the whole process is much more sustainable than simply saying, well, I'm vegan, therefore I'm doing something good. So it was a really interesting journey, like starting on the food side, then coming to the feed side. And And also on the animal ethics thing, it's like insect farming, unlike some animals, which I'm sure you've have a lot of experience with, cattle or chickens, especially, or pigs, you can treat them really horribly and end up with a decent product, right? That's what these massive industrial farms are. With insects, you can't really do that because they have to have like a Club Med for insects, basically. They have to have the right density, the right temperature, the right substrates. They have to live like the perfect situation in order to grow to the size that you want them to grow. And then if they're able to do that, whether it's crickets or black soldier fly, if they're able to do that, then you get a much better product. So farmers and producers are incentivized to do it in a way that is animal friendly for these insects, because you get a better product in the end by doing that.
Okay. Talk about, because you're doing black soldier flies a little bit. Talk a little bit about kind of like what the life cycle there for that is, because it's very short, correct?
Yeah, it is very short. So, the whole cycle, you have the pupation process, which takes a few days, and then they become flies for a few days, and they mate, lay eggs, etc. But the process of hatching the eggs and the larva consuming this waste and growing just exponentially is only 2 weeks. It's like 13 to 15 days. And there's a lot of experimentation going on now because there's been so much investment in the sector, especially in Europe the last few years, to see if they can shorten that cycle down, et cetera, a little bit genetic engineering, kind of tweaking, okay, how can we make it faster, more efficient on an industrial scale? But it's a very short process, and it consumes a massive amount of waste. So usually you want a feed conversion ratio that is beneficial for the producer. You don't want to be buying 5 kilos for every kilo of, or 5 pounds for every pound of meat that you're going to get, right? But in this case, it's actually beneficial that they consume far more than what they end up with. So conservatively, between 5 and 8 tons, you get 1 ton of live larvae.
Okay.
And so you're able to then consume a huge amount of organic waste with these insects. And obviously producers are incentivized to produce as much as they can in the way of insects. And so they're looking for the largest amount of organic waste that they can find. And so it's a beautiful process where you have one single entity, which is the black soldier fly larva, consuming 5 to 8 times its weight over a course of 2 weeks, and then producing 2 distinct products, which is animal feed and organic fertilizer, because the excrement of the larva is a nicely balanced NPK organic fertilizer. And so it's sort of a process the industry is going through a lot of changes, but it's something that people can do in their backyards as well. It's not something that has to be done on an industrial scale. So people who have homesteads, black soldier flies are not a plague. And so they'll grow. They need warmth. They do like warmth and sunshine, so it's a little bit tougher like in the winter unless you have a greenhouse or something. But they grow pretty much everywhere in the world. So all over the U.S. you could do it, especially in the spring and summer. And one of the benefits that homesteaders can have from doing BSF in their own backyard, and it's what we've sort of looked at with smallholder farmers here in Mexico and experimented with, is people use organic waste to feed their chickens or feed their pigs.
Correct.
But the risk of that is you can have bacteria that is in that waste that's rotting, and you're feeding that to your animal. So there is a much higher risk with that. Whereas if you essentially run it through the filter of the black soldier fly larva, they've discovered, 40 or 50 some peptides that break down all types of bacteria. And so even though it's very highly regulated in Europe, because of the regulations, it's been really beneficial for the industry, because companies have made and researchers have discovered so many interesting things about the black soldier fly larva because it's so highly regulated. So they have done tests like feeding BSF nothing but like E. coli and salmonella.
Yeah.
And it comes out with nothing. Like the peptides in its gut are able to basically completely eliminate it. And so it's a filter that homesteaders can use with your waste. You put it in a bin. It's fairly easy. There's tons of information online on how to do backyard BSF, and then you're able to filter that and feed that to pigs and chickens and fish, they
Yeah.
love BSF, whether you dry it or you just give it to them live. They love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have an egg producer who I'm sure, like, I'm just thinking about the amount of compost that we have that goes out to the farm. And it's, we have a big bin that we use and they take it out like at least once a week, if not every other week. And that would be a very easy thing for us to do. Run all that compost through the BSF. And then the actual larva could go to the chicken guy and the compost could just go right to the farm.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And they're going to be cleaning up and what's left. So you have the benefit of the excrement from the larva and then obviously whatever is left that they didn't consume. But that's going to be a much richer compost.
Yeah.
And there's synergy that people have done with earthworms as well, sort of because they eat more of a like a cellulose type of material, whereas the BSF like the wetter, sort of soggier, rotting stuff. The more disgusting, the better. The more they like it. And
so they like, rotting potatoes, melons.
Yep.
They
Avocados.
Bananas,
broccoli,
melons.
cauliflower, bananas. Yeah, any of that kind of stuff. Like they really like. They don't really like tomatoes, which is something that we discovered over the last year, and it's unfortunate because that's one of the biggest waste products that there is in Mexico.
Yeah.
They don't really like it that much, so we had to mix it in with other stuff.
Yeah, maybe it's the acidity.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but then if you hook them up with earthworms, you can actually get more of the green side of things, probably.
Yeah. Earthworms are obviously a longer process and whatnot, but there is a synergy that you can have there. And you can even run the frass from BSF back through mixed in with some of the stuff that would then be fed to the earthworms and really get, you could have a very complex setup that it sounds complex, but it's actually fairly simple once it's set up. And it just sort of is a continual process of cleaning up that waste and you get multiple products out of it.
Okay, so if one of the things obviously is expanding, contracting based on your availability in product, and I'm assuming that's relatively easy with black fly because they grow so fast.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by expanding?
So let's say you have, one bin of waste, and then the next week you have 3 bins of waste, and then you go back to 1 bin of waste. There's such a fast cycle. I feel like they could scale very quickly or reduce very quickly.
Yeah, and then it's a matter of making sure that you're not getting other larvae in there, other fly larvae. Like the green bottle fly larva looks kind of similar to the BSF. It's softer and squishier, whiter. And then you have other, smaller fly larvae, etc. But the BSF are generally not like an alpha predator, but in the fly larva world, they kind of are, which is weird because the flies themselves are really docile. They're really gentle. They don't bite. They don't sting. They just sort of hatch, mate. They don't even eat. They drink a little bit of water.
And
but
then
the larvae are something completely different. And I think it's just the natural cycle in nature. They are the forest or the jungle's cleaners. So if there's dead animals, if there's rotting matter, like they go in and they love it. They clean it up.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch if you have like a dead squirrel or something. It's kind of disgusting, but you can see that thing, get infected by these flies, and then the squirrel looks like it's moving, and it's because there's literally so many larvae inside it. And
Exactly.
It's crazy, but it's amazing just how nature can clean that all up.
Yeah, they clean all the meat off the bones. There's actually, this is just to stay on the disgusting topic for a second with the larvae, and this is one of the reasons actually why people don't like to think about eating them, because it's like, oh, maggots, they eat dead things. Yes. But there was a researcher, and he's high up in the BSF world now, but I had a conversation with him quite a few years ago, and he was talking about how he used to work with the police in South Africa where he was, and they would go and examine the age of the black soldier fly larvae that were in dead bodies and homicide cases to help the detectives figure out how many days the person had been dead.
Wow, because you can age it very easily.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's like an interesting little factoid about those larvae. That's like,
So you can use the larva for animal feed. Talk a little bit about I'm assuming it's super high in protein.
It is high in protein, yeah. Naturally, it depends on the substrate. It depends on what they're fed on. But generally, you're going to get around 40% protein before defatting. You can defat it, turn it into powder, and then you can get in the 60s and 70s. We've experimented. When I started working with Unique Biotech in Malaysia, I was still doing into vegan, and so we experimented on how high can we get the protein, because it's much less expensive to raise BSF than it is crickets.
Okay.
And there's a whole big difference between them. Crickets are
Yeah.
much more fragile. They have to have a very specific diet. Like you got to give them fresh pumpkin and leaves
Yeah.
and moringa, whatever. Whereas BSF eat everything. So it's an exponential difference in terms of the cost and the difficulty, etc. And so we experimented with a lot of different recipes basically for the substrate, and ended up being able to get to 68% protein before defat, which is like, everyone has told me, yeah, it's possible, but that's crazy that you were able to do that. Obviously, it's more expensive, but we were looking at how can we do this for snacks, because they actually really do taste good if they're fed on clean substrate. Then they can actually taste really good. I mean, I've had others that taste absolutely bitter.
Okay.
Because they were fed on something more like maybe a mix of manures or whatever.
Yes.
And during that time, I was just testing everything just to see how it tasted.
Exactly. Yeah. You were the guinea pig.
Trusting that the research papers I'd read that there is no E. coli or those bacteria in them after they're dried.
Yes.
But
so let's talk this harvesting then. So how do you harvest them if you were going to try to eat them?
This is another incredible thing about BSF. They self-harvest.
Okay.
So they will search for, when they're ready to turn into pupa, you can see that the color is different because they'll go from sort of a whitish, creamish, light brown color. They sort of get darker and darker through the process. And then when they start to get really dark, then they're ready to turn into pupae and then become flies. So they will look to leave the substrate. They like to be in wet substrate. So they will just go to the corners. For whatever reason, I've never seen a satisfactory explanation for why. If they're in a square bin or in a square cement pond, they always go to the corners, and then they try and escape. In Malaysia, we use the tent and pond method, which is like the ponds are 20 centimeters deep or something. And they just go to the corners, and they can't escape because they can't climb. They're not like a spider or something with sticky feet. So then they can be harvested that way. You can build your own self-harvesting bins, though.
Okay.
A lot of people do that.
Yeah, I think I've seen those online.
Yeah, so you basically just, in the corners, or in one corner, you put a little ramp that's not too steep so that they can still climb up it, and then just have that ramp like a tube, basically, that just drops into a bucket. And they'll essentially self-harvest for you.
Okay. And then I'm assuming, like, as long as you keep a good pile of substrate in there that they can keep, like you're filling it every single day, putting more in there, they'll continue just to lay, pupate, eat it, and eventually just work their way up and self-harvest.
Yeah, you can do it that way. The egg production is the challenging aspect of it.
Okay, all right.
Usually that's kept separate, and now the industry is sort of splitting as well. There's companies that are focused just on egg production. There's a company called Freeze M. I think they're in Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, that essentially has figured out how to keep the eggs or the larva in a not frozen, but in a very cold state to where they pause.
Hibernate? Yeah, okay.
Essentially. And so they're able to ship to anywhere in the world, and so it's sort of fragmenting into this more specificity of people focusing on one aspect or another. Because that is kind of the challenging aspect of BSF production, is making sure that you keep a certain percentage, allow them to turn into pupae and then become eggs. And you need sunshine, or you need LED lights that can simulate that. Because that's what they look for when they mate. So BSF flies, I guess, are kind of like a Bad Bunny song. They need heat, they need the playa, they need love, whatever, before they lay eggs. But that's how it is.
Yeah.
So
okay, all right, cool. So that is the one part that is a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, but if people wanted to do that, it would be a matter of, depending on where you live, what the temperatures are, if you need a greenhouse or something simple, just make sure that there is netting. You can use like a 1 or 2 meter net by 1 meter. And put LED light in, or if you have a place that's like they can get at least 5 or 6 hours of sun per day, and all they need is just a tiny little bit of water, some leaves to rest on between mating, because it's usually a fight between like two males and one female, and so they'll fight. They'll end up dropping to the ground or to the bottom of the little tent where they are, and then one of them will win, and then that's it. And then they'll go rest on a leaf, drink some water, and repeat the process, and basically until they die.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so it's something that can be done in mosquito netting, and you can do it with PVC tubing and something really simple like that. They just need warmth and that light. And they need the other thing of the process that's really important is you have to have something really stinky so that the females will lay the eggs. So what they look for, and many companies have different things. We use like that little eggies, which are, you can use cardboard. If you think about the side of a piece of cardboard,
yes,
it's like the corrugated aspect.
Yes,
that's about the perfect size of the gap that the female flies look for.
Okay.
To lay the eggs. And so you can make them with cardboard. You can just do them with wood slats and like put a tack in between and rubber band them together. So you have 5 or 6 of the little piece of wood with those kind of, I don't know what it would be in inch, like quarter inch. No, not quarter inch. Be a very small, fraction of an inch gap, so that they can.
What's it in millimeters?
I don't know, in millimeters. Maybe like 3 millimeters or something.
Okay. 3-5 millimeters, something like that. Okay.
But if you have that, then you can put that over the top of something that's really smelly. So you can use wire mesh. Probably the simplest way to do it in your backyard would be a very, very small wire mesh that a tiny larva would be able to get through, but nothing else could, so the flies couldn't get into it. And then you set your egg tray essentially on top of that, and you put something really nasty and smelly inside, like fish offal. Whatever's going to give off a really strong scent. And you change that every couple of days when you harvest the eggs, and just it'll keep the process going, because the females will look for something dry that is above a stinky substance. Instinctively, they know that the larvae are going to then hatch from the eggs, and they're going to go drop down into that stinky thing and consume it. So it's sort of the instinctive process.
Very cool.
Are you tired of scrambling to keep your garden plan on track? Whether you're growing a backyard garden or running a market garden like me, SeedTime is the perfect way to simplify crop planning. With SeedTime's calendar, I can map out my entire growing season based on my exact location and growing zone. It tells me when to seed, transplant, and harvest, all with super easy click and drop system. The task feature is a game changer. I get a daily or weekly checklist that keeps me on track and makes sure I never miss a step. And no losing gardening notes anymore, because the SeedTime Journal keeps everything organized in one place on your phone. It's the ultimate gardening calendar, helping me know exactly what to do and when to do it. Plus, we haven't even talked about their layout tool. For a limited time, you get $100 off lifetime access or 40% off your first year when you visit planwithseedtime.com to grab this deal today. That's planwithseedtime.com. Don't miss out on this game changer for gardeners, farmers, and homesteaders.
So then talk a little bit about kind of like where you think this is heading, because you've been working in this space for a while.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because I've had kind of a different journey than most of the people who have gotten into the space and immediately just raised money, and they went and did whatever they were going to do on their career arc, whether it was scientists or, I came at it from sort of a different aspect or a different angle. Started on the food side, got into now on the feed side, and then I worked also on the executive committee of AFIA, which is each continent sort of has its association for insect company producers. So I got to see kind of for a few years really behind the curtain, behind the scenes of what was going on in terms of government regulation and innovation and all of those things. The biggest challenge that I've seen, and I've talked about this since I started in the industry, is there's been so much push, and this is how it really ties to regenerative agriculture. There's been so much push in this sector to create alternative protein. And so the industry kicked off really after the 2013 FAO report about insects to feed the world. It's a very famous document from the United Nations that said insects as food and feed can help us to have alternative protein by 2050. The whole thing about 9 billion people, 10 billion people.
Yes, exactly.
So it's kind of gone in waves over the years, the sector has. Right now, it's in a very challenging place. And to me, it's like it's frustrating because I've been encouraging people to go more of the route that is the natural way versus what's been happening. And I mean, you've probably heard of some of the companies in the space like Insect and others who have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Insect, and they're mealworms, but it's the same sector. They raised over $500 million, and now they're in bankruptcy protection. 8 years later, because of a simple difference in how it's done in Africa, Asia, India, etc. In Europe and in North America, they're building these massive factories, temperature controlled, high energy, HVAC, all of these things, using robots. The whole thing is meant to be automated. So you have to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to build that. But you're doing it to produce something that doesn't need that. It's not rocket science.
Yes.
I mean, there's no there's some IP involved in certain things.
Yes.
Like our recipe on how we got to 68%. Like I don't share that, but
Correct.
everything else is like you can do in your backyard, or you can do on a small scale or a mid scale or a large scale. It really doesn't require automation and temperature control and all these things. And how is that sustainable anyway? So then it becomes almost greenwashing. Whereas the way that it's being done in Asia and in other places where it's still growing, as opposed to sort of having this retraction the last couple of years and now consolidation, is using ambient temperature, local labor. It's a little bit more capex in the beginning in terms of land footprint, let's say, but you end up with a much lower cost product and you're actually genuinely sustainable. So the farm in Malaysia was really cool as an example, because pre-pandemic, basically on site, we were growing a bunch of different crops, testing the frass on corn and on soursop and on durian and on golf course grass and all of these different things to see how it works, and for customers to also be able to come and see. And everything was integrated. Even the water that we used to wash the larva and to wash anything that came in, like as far as substrate, mixing that, all that water went into a pond that was then recycled and used for the crops. And it's like you can build this whole ecosystem around it. But the problem has been, well, that doesn't scale as quickly to a massive amount of return. So investors are saying, we want 10x to 100x over 5 to 7 years, and regenerative agriculture doesn't get us there. What I've seen both in this industry and also just in general in agriculture is a move finally toward regenerative ag, to where investors are realizing, wow, we wasted billions of dollars over the last decade in things like cell cultured meat, which they were never, almost no company was able to scale, because you get one little thing of bacteria that can destroy it overnight, and suddenly you have millions of dollars of damage because you have to wash out everything, clean, take it all apart, etc. So that's why nobody's really been able to get beyond like a small vat and do it on an industrial scale. Other things like vertical farming, it's like, okay, cool, we're growing lettuce, but can we really grow anything else? So there has been sort of a return to coming back to first principles of, okay, how is food actually produced? And like the whole idea that Joel Salatin, has talked about for so long of, well, grass is the best way. And then you run that through animals and all of these things. And for me, from the insect side, it's like, this can be incorporated with every type of regenerative agriculture.
Yes.
It's tough to convince investors of that. But I have seen a trend in, big investment funds and just in the news in terms of the chatter of what investors are looking at, getting away from the whole idea of so much pure ESG to more, okay, regenerative agriculture may be a longer play. Maybe it's 10 or 15 years before we really see that, the big results from it, but it's clear that it's going to work, versus throwing billions of dollars at something that, maybe won't work or maybe will be a trend, like, what is it, Impossible Foods, or the cell cultured meat, which spiked. The early investors made 100x, but everybody else now it's down 98% or something.
Yeah. Well, it's not even publicly traded; it's privately owned by a small group of investors. But you're right; there's no publicly, of what the return is. But from what I understand, it's not good.
Yeah, And that's because, these things come in trends. But the reality is the trend now, I think, with most people is going back to what is actually healthy. People want to be healthy. People want to consume real food. There's still this push to eat things that are not necessarily real because they're quote unquote sustainable. But in my experience, that was one of the interesting things I learned doing Into Vegan. People are not always vegans for the reasons that you might think. There's sort of three main reasons. One is, yeah, they care about the planet and they think that being vegan is better.
Okay.
Another one is health. They think that it's healthier. And then the third is the animal ethics aspect.
Correct.
It's like, I'm never eating animals because it's cruel. But each of those sort of has a counter argument that if people are open-minded, if people are genuinely looking for what is the best for my body, what is the healthiest, what is the best for the planet and the ecosystems, and what is the best for the animals and the ecosystems, then you can have an honest conversation about that. And you kind of have to end up coming back to the way that food has always produced, the way that nature produces everything and has for thousands of years, which is this sort of regenerative circular ecosystem where you're creating better soil, which creates better crops, which then whether it's livestock that are eating it or whether you're getting fruits and vegetables and berries and coffee and all of those things, the whole ecosystem is what's producing.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds to me like black soldier fly could be very it could be very individualized. So every single farmer should have their own little kind of system running, which obviously every farm has a waste product. The waste product goes in, you feed the larva to chickens, which produces the perfect food, which is eggs. Eggs can store a long time. Eggs are highly valuable in the marketplace. Then you can eat the chicken when it's done laying the eggs. You have the spent hens and the cockerels. So to me, there just seems to be so much aspect right there that could be broken down to a system that's doable for the small farmer around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a matter of education. There are people now that are sort of taking that approach as far as like starting like insect school or doing education or doing how-tos and all of these things, which is cool. And obviously you can find everything on YouTube. You can watch what other people are doing in Africa or in Asia or India. But it's the challenge, I think, for where we are, for example, in Mexico, looking to do something bigger on an industrial scale. We're waiting for a substrate provider, which is under construction. That's sort of been the stop
to hold up
at the moment. But working with smallholder farmers to do exactly that. And so what we're doing at the moment is, okay, this guy has a couple acres of coffee and he wants to do it organic coffee. And it's in an area that's rich and has a long history of coffee in Mexico. And so he's been experimenting with organic fertilizer. So we bring in black soldier fly fertilizer and we're doing tests and whatnot. And you see that even in periods of drought, when the other coffee farmers are not able to get the same yield, he's able to get a really, really good yield. His soil is holding in the humidity. There's a whole, the microbiome that you want to develop around the roots of the plants.
Correct.
Everything is just flourishing. And so then it's looking at, okay, so what people really want is transparency in the supply chain. What consumers really want is to know that they're not being lied to. They're not buying something, that's greenwashed and selling at 5 times the price. They want a real nutritious food or really delicious food, and they want to know the farmer. And that, I think, is a big trend in this space globally, is working with smallholder farmers. It still is like some 70% of the world's food is produced by smallholder farmers.
Correct. Yes.
And even if there are big companies who sort of control that, like Pepsi, for example, PepsiCo, they have like 40,000 potato farmers around the world for their potato chips for Frito-Lay.
Yeah.
And so they're managing that, but it is still smallholder farmers that are doing the production. And so to be able to work with these farmers and say, okay, let's produce something and then take that consumer product and tell the whole story of waste to soil to superfoods or organic coffee or whatever it is. And so that's where we've really been putting more effort right now, is there's some really cool products that you can create and a great story that you can tell then from, okay, we're cleaning up waste from these microbreweries and from these producers of, that sell in the wet markets and they have waste every day, et cetera. And then we're taking the frass and we're putting it on these coffee plants that then produce like truly organic coffee. And you can meet the producer and follow the whole thing. So rather than simply saying farm to table, which is good, I mean, that's great, we can say we know the waste substrate that the animal that's producing the fertilizer is consuming, and then we know where that fertilizer is going, so we can trace it like all the way back. So that's kind of the idea that I think has legs in terms of potential future for scaling locally, regionally. And I mean, who knows geopolitically what will happen. We've seen it with, traditional fertilizer or chemical fertilizers with the last couple of years in Ukraine and Russia. So
Yeah.
those kind of things geopolitically can change very quickly. And so to have an ecosystem, to build an ecosystem in a local area, in a regional area, and then, wider and wider, I think that will have potential. Is it going to get you 100x on your investment in 3 years? Probably not.
Yeah.
And so that's something that people have to be realistic about. And I saw that also in our industry in the beginning. A lot of people just took money and were like, fresh out of grad school with a PhD and as a researcher or whatever, and they don't realize like it's not going to be fun the first few years. Like you didn't get that money so that you can go and party with, like, that money means the investor expects to get 100x return on that. That's what they're looking for. They might lose it all, and they understand that. That's part of the game, but they're going to push you to get that return. And so that's I think now in looking at it as an entrepreneur, it's almost like, well, if investors are interested, cool. But if not, we have to figure out a way to bootstrap it and make it self-sufficient so that then it can grow in the way that, we're not looking to make 100x. We're looking to build something that we love to do every day and work within our region with these farmers and see a difference in their lives as well. Because that's another thing that happens, in the frontier and emerging markets. I've seen it for decades, is people that have farms, they get old and their kids want to move to the city and they want to, they want to have that new modern life, and so they're willing to sell the farm. I led a panel in Bangkok like a year or two ago on this very topic, and it was some big companies that were looking at how can we get young people involved in agriculture again, because it's lacking all over the world. Like, young people don't want to be farmers. So why is that? We're telling the wrong story about farming. Like, it's not just about money. It's about how can you see this as a lifestyle that is, worth having, worth doing, worth pursuing. How enjoyable can it be? And that's one of the cool things that I've seen in the US since, it's been happening for a long time, but it really expanded, I think, during the lockdowns. Is people homesteading, people wanting to do that. Now, like, millennials have 80 million chickens, right? It's like 13% of households in the US have backyard chickens. It's this whole thing. Yeah. And that's where we've been selling. We've been importing from Asia to the US and selling to backyard chicken farmers, just selling dried grubs, because it's a great chicken treat people use.
Yeah. Which brand is your guys's?
Unique Biotech.
Okay.
So we're Ultra Biotech in Mexico. They wouldn't let us have the name for some reason, but we're Unique Biotech in the US. So we started doing that just to position and see how the market was, et cetera. And it's cool. There's so many people that have backyard chickens and that are now understanding, oh, this is something I can add into the system. But even more, and not to compete with myself, but it's something that people can do themselves. If you live in the South, especially, or just even during the spring and summer, if you want to supplement and try it and experiment, it's not super complicated. It doesn't cost a lot to set that up, and then you're gonna get, the eggs, the quality of the eggs that come from hens fed on BSF is incredible. Like the size of the yolk, the color, the strength of the the inside of the eggshells, all of it. It's just much more nutritious. And the same goes for if you have pigs aquaculture, trout, or tilapia, or something like that.
Yeah.
Even dogs
Very
love it.
cool. Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Fascinating. So what's the typical way that you kill them? So they kind of come up out of the thing, and then you've got the grubs. Obviously, you can feed them live to a lot of places, but you may
Yeah.
also want to, obviously dry them.
Yeah, and that's something else to someone may want to consider is, okay, there may be something, if there was something in the substrate that wasn't consumed by them, it could be on the outside, it could be on their exoskeleton.
Correct.
So maybe
Yeah.
you want to wash them. The most humane way is to freeze them.
Okay.
Obviously, if you're doing it on a larger scale, that might not be cost effective, and so
Yeah.
people often will just wash them.
Okay.
Some places even
That
in
kind of drowns them.
yeah, essentially. Or
Okay.
if you use cold water also, then
Okay.
they're insects very much with cold, they just immediately kind of go to sleep. And so that's
Gotcha.
sort of a humane way, a simple way to do it. It's quick and easy, and then you're able to wash them at the same time. And then
Fascinating. Okay.
you can dry them, you can microwave them, you can just grind them up, depending on what you want to do, or you can extract the fat from them. Even with the small like oil extractors, depends on the size of what people are doing.
Yeah.
But on a larger
Fascinating.
scale, if someone has 100 pigs or something, and they want to extract the fat and use the fat to supplement for the piglets, for example, those machines are not super expensive to get. A grinding machine that'll just essentially, you would just wash them, and at that point you would just run them through the press, and
Okay,
you're going to get the
gotcha.
oil out of it, and then you're going to have what's left is protein and some fiber.
Fascinating. Okay. All right. Let's talk about some of the other things you've been involved in. You also have a honeybee product. I think that you've talked a little about that.
Yeah, so that's something that we've worked with an apicultor, a beekeeper, here in Mexico for the last few years, and it's been a really fun process because he has all kinds of organic fruit, and he has organic coffee as well, and so we've just worked on this whole thing of how can we get other products from your bees, which are being used to pollinate all of these crops. And there's a product called pan de abeja, which is bee bread. It's a kind of
Yes. I've heard of that. Yeah.
I'm not sure why the name is that. I guess because it's the food of the bees, and so whoever originally named it was like, oh well, it's the daily bread of the bees, and so therefore it's bee bread. It doesn't have anything to do with bread at all. It's essentially the bees use the enzymes in their saliva to ferment pollen with a little bit of propolis in it as well, and some honey, and that's what they consume. So it's a high energy product, but it's something that it doesn't lead to a crash. It's also fermented, and so it, as far as a gut brain connection and digestive health, it's incredibly nutritious. And so through the process of, okay, how can we tie in BSF with this, and that's where we landed on the waste to soil to superfoods, because everything that is pollinated, you're benefiting the ecosystem there as far as the floration and the production of those crops, but also you get better pollen if the roots of those plants are healthier and more nutritious, and they're bringing in the nutrients, and then that pollen is going to be better. Then the bees are fermenting a more nutritious pollen. And what happens with pollen, it's a trendy product as far as a supplement. A lot of people consume it, but pollen is difficult for the human body to break down in actuality. And so the gut doesn't necessarily access all of the nutrients that it can, because it's sort of protected in this like cellulose type of material. Which what happens in the fermentation process is it opens that pollen up, and it makes those nutrients more accessible. So the bees, this is another thing that's completely natural. It's not rocket science. There's no way to really put our human touch into it other than just figuring out how to process it sustainably and keep the bees happy and make it as nutritious as possible. But essentially their saliva is fermenting it, and it turns into this incredibly nutritious and really, really tasty product. And we've done a little bit in terms of figuring out different combinations of taking the bee bread 100% and mixing it and allowing it to sit and ferment for a certain periods of time at certain temperatures, etc., in order to get just the maximum fermentation of the process and the best taste, because it changes obviously by the season, it changes by where you are, the region, the types of flowers, pollen, etc. But it's something that I've been really surprised. Like I love it, and sometimes when I love products, I'm like, well, maybe I just love it. But then I start giving it to people and they go crazy and they're like, wow, like I have so much energy, or like this health issue that I had went away and my doctor like can't believe it because now like my blood pressure is lower, or I feel so much better, or this thing that I had on my skin like just completely went away. So I've found a ton of research on it, mostly from Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia, different places. And so we just decided, well, now we've been working on it for a few years, just testing different things, just kind of as a fun side project. But now it's become something where it's like, oh, this is actually a really good product that we love, that we can produce consistently. So let's do something with this and tie it in with the story of UB in how we are helping those ecosystems where the bees are getting their pollen from in the first place through a more sustainable, natural manner of healing the soil, essentially. But then it's the microbiome of the soil and then the microbiome of the gut. So those are both connected in this beautiful way that really we didn't have anything to do with. It's just nature will do that if you're letting nature be nature. We just simply found a way of, oh, this is something that's not really used, and we can use it, market it.
Now, producing that must be incredibly challenging.
It's not, actually. Well, I should say it's really, really difficult. Nobody try it. But no, the reality is you need a certain amount of pollen. You need a certain amount of beehives. And the taste varies quite dramatically based on the region and where that comes from. But the production it's not that challenging. It's simply a matter of mixture. So it's kind of like our secret sauce is the recipe, the time, the temperature, the mixture of what's there. But it's something that's natural that the bees eat. There's another product actually that bees also eat, and I don't mind saying this because it's not a secret. It's something that I wish was out there for myself, and so we've started working on this as well, and that is zanganos, which is the bee larva, the drone bee larva.
Oh, okay.
So it was something that I learned actually again in Southeast Asia. Usually in rural areas, people have these like ancient secrets that modern agriculture or big food, whatever they would say, no, that's just old wives' tale. And now we're coming back to realize, no, it's actually not. So bee larva is full of sex hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estradiol, prolactin, etc.
Okay.
And so the people in these rural areas in Southeast Asia, like the men will eat the honeycomb with the bee larva, the drone bee larva, in order to, it's like a natural Viagra type of thing. It doesn't have that effect, but it's like a natural testosterone booster for fertility, let's say.
Well, I'm assuming because it's so nutritious as well, it just gives you a boost.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so these drone bees, or the drone bees, only around 15% of them have a chance to mate with the queen bee. And then when they do, they immediately die. So it's essentially like, hopefully it was good because now you're dead. But the rest of the drones are essentially a waste product of the bee colony. And so you can extract them without, bothering the hives. And the thing that blew my mind, and when I first got really into this, was Southeast Asia, hearing about how this is like a sexual tonic or a booster, a testosterone booster.
Yeah.
And then I was at an insect conference that I presented about Innovegan in Germany, and someone else had presented on the waste of the drone bees in Germany, how they throw away like 3,000 tons of drone bee larvae per year because they use it to attract the varroa mite. I think that's how you say it. The little mite that causes problems for honeybees.
Yes.
So they will produce extra drones. So you can sort of simulate or stimulate the bees to do what you want them to do in terms of if you want more honey, if you want pollen production, propolis, like drone bees. So they will do that in order that the mites will attack those hives first. And then they're essentially just sacrificing some drone bee larvae to protect the other hives that are productive. But they throw away thousands of tons of this stuff every year. And it's something that you can, like the easiest way is simply to freeze the panel of the hive that has all the drone bees. And then as soon as it's frozen, you break it open and all the larvae come out. Because they're very sensitive. You want to extract them like around 7 to 8 days. That's like the peak sexual hormones that they have in them. But the skin is really, really thin. It's super sensitive. And if it's exposed to air, to oxygen, it oxidates really quickly. So you have to immediately freeze it or process it in some way. But it's something that has massive potential also for fertility. And we have this huge problem, especially in the West, of fertility. And there's other reasons why people are having kids too, right? But fertility and lowered testosterone, it's a problem. And this is something that is completely natural that can be used. And there's tons of studies. Most of them are not about people. Most of them are on animals. But they've used it as a fertility booster for sheep, for pigs, in livestock, and for both male and female. This is something I still haven't gotten clarification on to understand how that works. But the only conclusion I can come to right now is that it works as an adaptogen. So the way adaptogens are is it's not necessarily a supplement, it's not a stimulant, it's working with your body's natural balance to be optimized. And so if you have those hormones present to where they can increase fertility in female sheep or in male pigs, like how does that work? Well, if it's an adaptogen, if it has testosterone, progesterone, estradiol, prolactin, if it has those things in it, then if you're a guy, it's going to be an adaptogen that's going to help you to regulate testosterone more than anything else. If you're a woman, then it's going to help you to regulate estrogen. That's the only thing that the only conclusion that I can come to from all the research that I've read. And there's very, very few, big studies that have been done on people. So it's something that hopefully will be done, or maybe we can do on a small size to see. But it has exciting potential, I think, as an adaptogen type of supplement for reproductive health. And it's something that's completely natural, that's essentially, again, a waste product of that industry. But it's something we could use.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are so many different rabbit holes you can go down that you just don't realize are incredible opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the things that is so fascinating about the insect industry in general. Like, it's kind of funny. I never had any idea that I would think insects were so fascinating. I mean, I grew up always interested in nature and loved nature and, played with bugs and snakes or whatever when I was younger. But that's one of the cool things is there's so much to discover. And so whether it's like, I'm sure there's a cure for cancer on the dust of some moth that lives in some place that we just don't even think to go and look, right? And we're just scratching the surface of, there's hundreds, now I think it's a couple thousand different species of insect which are edible around the world.
Yeah.
And so it's like this whole ecosystem of foods or feeds and fertilizers, and we're only using like 5 of those insects to even do any research on.
Correct. Yeah.
So there's this whole world out there that nature provides. We simply have to look, instead of looking at it as how can we extract the most fiat money from nature, how can we create the most incredible world and ecosystem, and how can we flourish as humans with these things that nature offers and work in conjunction with nature. And if we can look at it from that perspective, which I think that's sort of where, especially regenerative agriculture, the trend is going much more towards, hey, let's get back to connecting with the land. Cities are cool and everything, modern technology is cool, but there's just something about putting your feet in grass and feeling dirt in your hands. It's like, it's something that our human nature needs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Josh, that was excellent. Anything else you'd like to share before we go?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to chat. It was great chatting with you, and
Yeah.
I'm a
You
little
have a
excited
website.
about bugs. I know people think that that's weird. I never expected I'd be doing it, like,
Yeah.
but it's something that I think can plug into the core of any homestead. Something that can plug into the core of larger agricultural production, livestock, etc. And I mean, I've seen great success with it. So,
Yeah.
if people want to chat about possible solutions, they can reach out, or they can just go online and do their own research and try and figure it out. There's a lot of information, and it's something that, honestly, don't be intimidated by the fact that XYZ companies are raising hundreds of millions of dollars. You can do it on your homestead or on your farm. It's something that you can figure out, and it will be beneficial for your livestock and crops.
Yeah. And your website is joshgalt.com, GALT.com.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the company website's ubsoldierfly.com, and in Mexico it's ultrabiotech.mx.
Okay. Very cool. Well, awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. This was fascinating. Always interesting to learn about a new sub area of farming and all the different aspects of it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.